Welcome back to the Zane and Shub College Football channel here on YouTube. Today we're going to go through a video upon request about what the 12-team college football playoff would have looked like in past seasons. I'm going to turn this into a 3-part series. If you guys really like this video and give some support for the video, I will make more. So we're going to start here by going through what the 12-team college football playoff would have looked like in 2021, 2020, 19, and 2018. If you want to see what my thoughts would have been like for this past season in 2022, what that 12-team playoff would have looked like, go ahead and check out that video. And without further ado, let's get into it. 2021 is a season that is pretty fresh in most people's minds, I would say. This is the season where the Georgia Bulldogs, quote-unquote, slayed the dragon. Kirby Smart won his first national championship at Georgia. He finally beat Nick Saban. Bryce Young won the Heisman this year, and a lot of people remember this year as the season where Cincinnati broke the barrier as the first group of 5 team to make the college football playoff. So this is what the 12-team playoff format would have looked like this season, starting with Oklahoma State and Ole Miss. So this was an Oklahoma State team. They had the number 2 defense in the country, led by Malcolm Rodriguez at linebacker. This defense was no joke. And then you have Ole Miss, who was head coached by Lane Kiffin, of course, and their quarterback, Matt Corral. So I think that Oklahoma State would have won this game. Now keep in mind, these first-round matchups are played at the higher seeds home stadium. So despite this being played in Oxford at Ole Miss, I think Oklahoma State would have won. It would have been very close. I think betting-wise, OSU would have been about a 3-point favorite. So Oklahoma State moves on to face Alabama next. We have Pitt and Georgia in the first round. Georgia at home against Kenny Pickett and the Pitt Panthers, who won the ACC that season. Give me UGA. This was pretty much a very similar team offensively to what we saw this past year, led by Stetson Bennett quarterback. Brock Bowers emerged as a freshman this year. And this Georgia team had the number 1 defense with 5 first-round picks this season in the draft. Incredible. I don't think there's any debate here. Georgia would have handled Pitt. I think Georgia would have won by 3 scores or more. And then moving over here to a rematch between Michigan State and Ohio State. This was a Michigan State team headlined by Kenneth Walker at running back, and then Ohio State with CJ Stroud at quarterback in his first season as the starter. And he had a wide receiver core with a few guys named Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, and Jackson Smith and Jigba. This Ohio State team offensively was insanely talented, and these two played during the regular season. They are in the same division, and Ohio State won that game 56-7 at home, and now they rematch in the college football playoff. And yeah, I don't think it would have looked much different, to be honest. And then down here to Utah and Notre Dame. This was a Utah team who won the Pac-12, led by an emerging QB, Cam Rising, in his first season as the starter. And then a Notre Dame team led by defensive back Kyle Hamilton. This was a solid Notre Dame team, but I think Utah would have won a very close game on the road in South Bend. Utah was playing really well at the end of the season. They were peaking at the end of the season, and based on what I saw from Utah in that Rose Bowl against Ohio State, I think that they would have went into South Bend and beat Notre Dame, but it would have been close. So now we have this quarterfinals set up here. Oklahoma State and Alabama. Now these are played at neutral fields in the bowl games, of course. Alabama led by quarterback Bryce Young, who won the Heisman. Will Anderson had an amazing season this year. I think Alabama would have handled Oklahoma State pretty easily. Bama would have won by 2 scores or more. And then down here to Baylor and Georgia. Now this is where it kind of gets interesting, because this format allows a team like Baylor, who won the Big 12, to get a bye week before they host Georgia. Georgia, of course, was a much more talented team. Georgia would have been a pretty heavy favorite in this game, and I think Georgia would have won. Despite Georgia having to play a first-round matchup, I don't think it really would have mattered. I think talent discrepancy here just sort of gives Georgia a big edge here, and I think Georgia would have won by 2 scores and more, similar to Alabama over Oklahoma State. And then over here to the other side, now this is where Ohio State and Michigan, I said it on our podcast multiple times, if we had a 12-team playoff this year and these two teams rematched, We saw Michigan beat Ohio State 42-27 at home this season. They finally got that monkey off their back. They won the Big Ten. Michigan finally broke the streak. We get a rematch here with the expanded playoff, and I think Ohio State gets them. I'm sorry, Michigan fans, but I think a lot of things went right for Michigan in that game that year. They were at home. It was snowing. I think if you rematch on a neutral field, give me Ohio State in the rematch. It's hard to beat a really good team twice, and I think Ohio State wins, but it would have been an epic rematch to say the least. And then Cincinnati and Utah. I think Cincinnati really got a good draw here with being the 3 seed in this hypothetical playoff this season. But I think Utah, of these teams, was probably the best chance that Cincinnati would have had to advance to the semifinals. And I think that's what would have happened. This was a Cincinnati team that was very talented. They had a lot of players drafted off their defense. They were, of course, led by Desmond Ridder and had a cornerback named Ahmad Sauce Gardner. I think Cincinnati wins this game, and I think it would have been a great game. It would have been close. So I have Cincinnati moving on. And also I had to put a little box around their logo here because it blends in with the black background. But moving on here, so the semifinals, we have Bama and Georgia. This is what the national championship was that season, and Georgia finally won 33-17. They got that big pick six from Kaylee Ringo at the end. Very rarely are you going to see me go against precedent, real life precedent, I should say, i.e., you're not going to see me overturn results of what happened in real life. And we saw this one happen in real life. I got to give it to Georgia, even though I will hear the argument that Georgia would have had to play 2 games as opposed to Alabama, who would have only had to play 1. The thing is, I just don't think Georgia would have been tested that much against Pitt or Baylor, so I really do believe that Georgia would have been relatively in good condition to face Alabama here in a rematch, and I think Georgia wins in this format as they did in real life in the 4-team format. And then over here, Ohio State and Cincinnati, man, oh man, the storylines for this game would have been insane. You have an in-state matchup, the big dogs, Ohio State, the little dogs, Cincinnati, an in-state matchup to go to the national championship. I'm sorry, Cincinnati fans, but this is where it would have came to an end. Ohio State would have won. As far as betting, I think Ohio State would have been about a 7 to 9 point favorite. It would have been really fun to see Sauce Gardner and some of those Cincinnati DBs face off against Ohio State's offense and those wide receivers. But at the end of the day, Ohio State just a much more talented team overall, and I think that the talent discrepancy there would have won out, and I think Ohio State advances to face Georgia in the national championship. So, in real life, we saw Georgia and Alabama, but they would have been on the same side of the bracket here, so we would have had a different national championship game. I think Georgia was just a notch above Ohio State that year, and I believe Georgia was the best team that season. They had one stumble against Alabama in the SEC championship game, but 12-team format or 14 playoff, the Georgia Bulldogs, I think, would have won the national championship. That defense was absolutely insane, and so yeah, that's who I would have had winning. Let's move on to 2020. So this season was known as the COVID season. I'm sure most everyone watching is well aware of what happened in all of sports this season. The SEC, ACC, and Big 12 played a full normal season slate, while the Big 10 and the Pac-12 lagged behind and played as little as 5 to 7 conference games that season. Alabama went on to win the national championship. Devontae Smith, their star receiver, won the Heisman. You may remember a shoe throw as part of the lore around what happened this season. Now, I have an asterisk here next to the 2020 there at the bottom for a reason, and that's because, well, it was kind of a mess. Certain teams only played 5 games during the regular season. You may notice there is no Pac-12 team in this field, and that's because the Pac-12 only played 5 games. Some Pac-12 teams only played 4 games. So that's why you see a lot of teams here that normally would never get in would have gotten in this format. So let's start here at the top left, UGA and Cincinnati. Georgia had a QB trio this season of Stetson Bennett, JT Daniels, and DeJuan Mathis. This was a quote-unquote down season for Georgia. They went 7-2. They did not make the SEC championship game. And then we have Cincinnati. They were led by junior quarterback Desmond Ridder, a very young but talented defense that was pretty good this year. They went 9-0 during the regular season, won the American Athletic Conference. So it just so happened that we got to see these two teams face off in the Peach Bowl this season, and Georgia won that game 24-21. It was very competitive. However, in this format, Cincinnati would have been played at home, so Georgia would have had to travel to play at Cincinnati. Now, who am I going to pick to win this game? Well, it's hard to overturn what happened in real life. I am going to pick Georgia. Now, I know some of you may be saying, oh, well, Cincinnati would have been at home in this format. Yes, that is true, but keep in mind, home field advantage wasn't really that big of a thing this year because stadiums were basically only a quarter full of fans. And secondly, in that Peach Bowl, Georgia had a few guys opt out. They were definitely not playing at full strength, and obviously in a playoffs format, Georgia would be playing at full strength. I do think Cincinnati would have had a realistic chance, but I think Georgia would have won in that scenario. And they go on to face Alabama. So now down to the 12-5 matchup. This was a Coastal Carolina team that was led by a breakout season from their redshirt freshman quarterback, Grayson McCall. This Chanticleers team went 11-0 virtually out of nowhere and won the Sun Belt Conference. And then we have Notre Dame, who was led by their senior quarterback, Ian Book. Notre Dame was granted special privilege by the ACC to join the conference and play an ACC schedule that season. And who do I think would have won this game? Well, I think it would have been Notre Dame. Notre Dame, I think, wins this game by about 10 points. Now moving on to Iowa State and Florida. That Iowa State team in 2020 was led by their quarterback, Brock Purdy, and their star running back, Breece Hall. They lost the Big 12 championship game to Oklahoma, but they still would have managed to get into the 12-team format. And then Florida. They would have been hosting this game. They were a team led by Kyle Trask at quarterback, Kadarius Toney, and Kyle Pitts, a three-headed monster on the offensive side of the ball. This team beat Georgia this season and made it to the SEC championship game. I think this would have been very competitive, but I'm going to go with Florida. I think Florida is just a little bit better of a team. That offense was very, very good. Iowa State was a bit more balanced, but I think that Florida would have edged them out. But don't get me wrong, I think Iowa State certainly would have had a shot in this one. Now down here to Indiana and Texas A&M. Indiana was led by Michael Penix at quarterback. Yes, he used to be at Indiana once upon a time. This was a season where Indiana went 6-1. And then Texas A&M, who was led by their quarterback, Kellen Mond, who was a senior this season. A&M went 8-1 in SEC play and had a very solid year. And these two playing, I think it would have been Texas A&M who would have won. Texas A&M, I think, would have won by about 7 points. Now moving on to the quarterfinals. UGA versus Bama. Man, where have we seen this matchup before? Give me Alabama. It's not really a debate. This Alabama team was just stacked. They had Mac Jones at quarterback, Najee Harris at running back, Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, a whole other cast of characters. This offense was elite. They went 11-0 and won the SEC, and they had already beaten Georgia in the regular season by a score of 41-24 this season. This Georgia team was really nothing special this year in 2020. So Alabama moves on, I think, relatively easily. And then Oklahoma and Notre Dame. This would have been a pretty competitive game in my opinion. Oklahoma was led by then redshirt freshman Spencer Rattler. They ended up winning the Big 12, and I think that it would have been OU. This would have been a very competitive game in my opinion. Notre Dame certainly is capable of beating them, but with the way that Oklahoma was playing towards the end of the season, I think that Oklahoma would have won, especially given that they would have had a bye to prepare for Notre Dame, and Notre Dame would have had to play that extra game. Now next up, UF and Clemson. I think this would have been really fun to watch. I think it would have been really fun to see both of these offenses go at it. Clemson was led by junior quarterback Trevor Lawrence playing in his final season before the NFL draft, and they had a running back named Travis Etienne as well. And this Clemson defense was pretty good too. This Clemson defense statistically was number 3 in the country. I think Florida actually could have given them a good fight, but Clemson, just the overall more balanced team, way better defense. That Florida defense was not that great, and Clemson would move on. Ohio State and Texas A&M now. This Ohio State team was led by Justin Fields in his final season. The thing with Ohio State this year is that they had only played 5 regular season games. They were granted special permission by the Big Ten to play in the Big Ten championship game. They won the Big Ten. I think they would have beaten A&M here in the quarterfinals. I think Ohio State would have won this game by about 2 scores. Ohio State, I just think they would have handled Texas A&M this season. Texas A&M was a good team, but they just were not an elite team this season, and I think Ohio State would have gotten them. So now the semifinals. We have Alabama and Oklahoma. Give me Alabama. It's not really that close of a debate. This Alabama team, I've said it before, they were so good. I think Oklahoma would have actually been relatively competitive. I say relatively, but I still think Alabama wins pretty comfortably here. And then Ohio State and Clemson. We happen to have this exact matchup in the semifinals this season, and Ohio State beat Clemson pretty handedly. Ohio State won this game 49-28 in real life. So I have to pick Ohio State to win. That's probably what would have happened in this format. And then we have the national championship, which happened to be the same national championship we got in real life this season, Alabama versus Ohio State. These were the best 2 teams in this season, undoubtedly. And as far as who wins, it's Alabama. This Alabama team was very good. It's kind of a shame that they didn't get to play a full season, a full normal season, I should say, because this team was just loaded with a bunch of NFL talent, and it doesn't matter what the format was, Alabama would have won in 2020, asterisk or not. So now let's move on to 2019. 2019 was the season commonly referred to as the Joe Burrow year. Yes, the LSU Tigers went on a tear this season. They took college football by storm. Joe Burrow won the Heisman this season, and he led his LSU Tigers to a perfect 15-0 record, won the national championship, and destroyed top 10 teams in their path all season long. You may also remember the controversial semifinal game between Ohio State and Clemson, and there was a lot of NFL talent at the top of the sport this season. So let's get into it. This is how the bracket would have looked like for 2019. So starting in the 9-8 matchup, we would have had the Florida Gators, who would have gone to Madison to face the Wisconsin Badgers. Florida was led by an emerging starting quarterback, Kyle Trask, who took over earlier in the season for an injured Felipe Franks. Then you have Wisconsin, who lost the Big Ten championship game to Ohio State, but they were headlined by their star running back, Jonathan Taylor. Now with this matchup, these are 2 balanced teams in my opinion, both offensively and defensively. I think this is truly a coin flip game. And when it's a coin flip game, and in the first round you have teams playing at home as the higher seed, I gotta give the edge to Wisconsin simply because they are at home, but this is a coin flip. You can convince me either way here. So next up, the 12-5 matchup, we have Memphis, who was led by head coach Mike Norvell and had a talented running back room headlined by redshirt freshman Kenneth Gainwell. This Memphis team won the American Athletic Conference and was the G5 representative, and they would have matched up against Georgia, the 5 seed. Georgia also had a talented running back room this year, headlined by DeAndre Swift. As far as the results, I think UGA would have been about a 2-touchdown favorite, and this is pretty easy. I think Georgia would have beaten Memphis. So Georgia moves on to face Oklahoma in the quarterfinals. And now the 10-7 Penn State versus Baylor. This is an interesting one. This Penn State team in 2019 had talented pass catchers such as KJ Hamler, Pat Freiermuth, Jahan Dotson, and they also had a defense that was led by young sophomore linebacker Micah Parsons at the time. And then you have Baylor. Baylor lost the Big 12 championship game to Oklahoma this year. They were led by starting quarterback Charlie Brewer, and they also had a pretty good defense. This was also the final season of head coach Matt Rule's tenure there in Waco as well. So as far as this game, Penn State actually would have been about a 3-point favorite on the road here in Waco. And I got to give the edge here to the Nittany Lions. I think this would have been competitive, but I'm going to give the edge to Penn State. This team actually had a lot of NFL talent on its team, and I think they would have edged out Baylor. The 11-6 matchup, Utah versus Oregon, another dreaded rematch. These two teams played each other in the Pac-12 championship game this season. Oregon won that game 37-15, and here they are rematching in the first round. Utah was led by senior quarterback Tyler Huntley, and they had a very talented defense with a handful of pretty good future NFL players on that team. And then you have Oregon, who won the Pac-12, of course, and they were led by starting quarterback Justin Herbert, and they also had a rising star freshman, Kayvon Thibodeaux, at defensive end. Well, we saw this matchup in the Pac-12 championship game. Oregon beat Utah on a neutral field. If they rematched, it would have been at Oregon. Give me the Ducks. I don't think there's any debate here. And that fills out the quarterfinal matchups. So now Wisconsin and LSU back to the top left. This LSU team, of course, everybody knows they were led by Joe Burrow, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson. I mean, there was a litany of future star NFL players on this team. And I think they would have beaten Wisconsin by about 3 scores or more. I think LSU moves on. And now Oklahoma and Georgia. This is a very interesting matchup here. I feel like the 4-5 matchups always seem to give us some interesting ones. OU was led by transfer quarterback Jalen Hurts, who had come over to play this season from Alabama. And they also had a star wide receiver named CeeDee Lamb. So as far as this matchup, I think this is also another coin flip game that could go either way. I'm going to give the edge to Oklahoma only because OU would have had a bye week to prepare for Georgia. Georgia would have had to play the extra game. And I'm just going to give the edge to Oklahoma. And I think Jalen Hurts just would have found a way to beat Georgia. This would have been a pretty good game, a really good offense versus a good defense. But you can convince me either way on this one, but I'm going to give the edge to OU just for having to play one less game. And now moving on here to Penn State and Ohio State. It seems like Ohio State always seems to match up against fellow division opponents in these hypothetical playoff formats. And here we are again, Ohio State rematching against Penn State. These two played, of course, in the regular season. Ohio State won that game 28-17 at home. And this Ohio State team was also pretty good in its own right. They were 13-0, won the Big Ten. They were led by sophomore quarterback Justin Fields, who had transferred over from Georgia. And they also had some future star NFL players such as J.K. Dobbins, Chase Young, and Jeff Okudah. I think Ohio State would have won this game, again, for similar reasons to Oklahoma. One, Ohio State beat Penn State already in the regular season, and Penn State would have had to play a really competitive game against Baylor. So I think Ohio State, fresh and ready, would have beaten either one of these teams. And now Clemson and Oregon. This would have been an interesting matchup. You have Clemson led by sophomore quarterback Trevor Lawrence, and their defense was also led by linebacker Isaiah Simmons, the Swiss Army knife. This would have been a pretty interesting matchup, Trevor Lawrence versus Justin Herbert. However, if many of you recall, Justin Herbert really didn't live up to his full potential in college. He has been a better NFL player than he was at Oregon, and Clemson just had a better team. So on a neutral field, give me Clemson. So we have our Final Four here. This was the same exact Final Four that was the 4 teams that made the playoff in real life. LSU and Oklahoma. We saw this one. I think everyone remembers this game. It was non-competitive. LSU won this game 63-28. No argument here from me. LSU wins this game. And then Ohio State and Clemson. This was the controversial semifinal matchup I had mentioned earlier. I really do believe that if you were able to go back in time and replay this game, I think Ohio State wins more often than not. I think Ohio State was the slightly better team than Clemson. However, Clemson did beat Ohio State this year, and I've said it earlier on this video. I am not going to overturn real-life results except for some extreme exceptions, and I'm not going to allow this to be an exception. I'm going to say Clemson wins. We saw it happen in real life, so I'm going to say Clemson wins, but I will very much hear the arguments that Ohio State could have beaten Clemson if those two teams played again. So now we have our national championship, just like in real life with the 4-team format, LSU versus Clemson. LSU won this game 42-25. No debate here from me. Once again, LSU would have won the national championship this season. This was one of the best teams in all of college football in the last 20 years, in my opinion, if not one of the best teams of all time. This LSU team had 7 future first-round draft picks on it. You can argue that they may not be the best team of all time in college football history, but I don't think there's any debate that this LSU team had the best resume of any college football team of all time. This team was very good, and there is no doubt 15-0. In this case, LSU would have been 16-0, and they win the 12-team playoff. So now let's move on to 2018. So the 2018 season was dominated by 2 heavyweights at the top of the sport. You had Alabama and sophomore quarterback Tua Tagovailoa, and you had Clemson with true freshman quarterback Trevor Lawrence. Clemson ended up winning the national championship game over Alabama, and Trevor Lawrence took college football by storm. This was the second national championship under Dabo Swinney for Clemson. Kyler Murray also won the Heisman this season. Many of you may remember Minshew Mania. So this is what the bracket would have looked like for 2018. In the 9-8 matchup, we have Washington versus UCF. This Washington team was 9-3. They were the Pac-12 champions, and they had a pretty solid defense led by cornerback Byron Murphy. And then on the other hand, you have UCF. UCF was 12-0, American Conference champions, and at this point in time, going into bowl season, they had a 25-game win streak dating back to 2017. Their quarterback was Mackenzie Milton, and their leading receiver was Gabe Davis. There was a lot of hype about UCF at this point in time, based on what they had done this season and the season before, but I hate to do it, Washington would have won this game. As far as betting wise, Washington would have been a favorite in this game despite it being played at the Bounce House in Orlando. This UCF team really wasn't as good as it was in 2017 in my opinion. I think that Washington was a pretty underrated team this year. They did end up winning the Pac-12, and I think Washington would have got the W in the Bounce House, but it would have been competitive, don't get me wrong. So now Penn State and Notre Dame in the 12-5 matchup. So normally when you do this exercise, you'll see that the 12-5 matchups usually are pretty non-competitive, but this year that's not the case. I think this would have been a pretty competitive matchup. You have Penn State, who was 9-3, led by their senior quarterback Trace McSorley. They also had Miles Sanders as their starting running back this year. This Penn State running back room was pretty talented. And then you have Notre Dame. This Notre Dame team was 12-0, led by junior quarterback Ian Book. They also had Chase Claypool as one of their top receivers on this team. They ended up making the college football playoff before getting annihilated by Clemson. So as far as who wins this game, I'm going to give the edge to Notre Dame. I think this would have been very competitive. I think that Penn State would have had a legitimate shot to go into South Bend and beat this Irish team, but I still think Notre Dame was slightly better, so I'm going to have Notre Dame moving on. Next up, we have Florida and Michigan in the 10-7 matchup. This Florida team was 9-3. They were led by quarterback Felipe Franks under first-year head coach Dan Mullen. And then you have Michigan. Michigan went 10-2, and they were led by their starting quarterback Shea Patterson. So these two teams happened to play each other in the Peach Bowl that season, and the Gators won that game 41-15 in blowout fashion. So because we got to see these two teams play head-to-head this year, I'm going to go with Florida. Of course, Florida would have had to go to the Big House in late December, early January in some harsh winter conditions. Michigan would have had a huge home field advantage in this game. I know that would have played a huge factor, and this would have made this game very competitive. However, I have to go with Florida. They did end up winning in blowout fashion after all. And then we have LSU and Georgia in the 11-6, an SEC rematch down here. LSU was 9-3, and this team was led by transfer quarterback Joe Burrow in his first season at LSU after transferring over from Ohio State. And this team also had a solid defense led by linebacker Devin White. And then you have UGA. Georgia was 11-2. They had a narrow SEC championship game loss to Alabama this season, and they were led by their starting quarterback, sophomore Jake Fromm. So these two teams happened to play each other in the regular season, and LSU won that game 36-16 in Death Valley. However, going back and looking at this game, this was arguably one of Georgia's worst performed games of all season. They lost a turnover battle 4-0. They fumbled the ball twice. I think that if these two teams rematched, this time Georgia would have been at home in Athens. I'm going to give the edge to Georgia. I think they would have got their revenge over LSU and they move on. So now we have the quarterfinals, Washington versus Alabama. This Alabama team was stacked. They were 13-0 SEC champions, led by sophomore quarterback Tua Tagovailoa, who was having an amazing season. They had a loaded running back room, a loaded wide receiver room per usual, and they had a really good defense led by edge rusher Quinnen Williams. Bama would have been favored in this game by about 15 to 17 points. I don't think this would have been competitive. Bama would have won this game all day over Washington or UCF. It wouldn't have mattered who won that game. And then we have Ohio State and Notre Dame. Ohio State, of course, won the Big Ten, so they get the bye week. They were 12-1. They had a pretty good offense led by sophomore quarterback Dwayne Haskins, and they would have been about a 6-point favorite over Notre Dame. Despite this Notre Dame team making the CFP this year, I don't think that Notre Dame team was really playoff worthy. They had a lot of luck go their way in one-score games, and Ohio State, fresh off of a bye week, I think would have edged out Notre Dame. So give me the Buckeyes here. And then we have Florida and Clemson. This Clemson team was pretty similar to Alabama this year. They were 13-0 ACC champions, led by freshman quarterback Trevor Lawrence, who took over for Kelly Bryant earlier in that season. They had an insanely good defensive line, Clemson did, with 3 first-round picks that went in the draft that season. Clemson, I think, would have won this game by at least 2 scores or more. I think they would have handled Florida pretty easily. And then we have Oklahoma and Georgia. These two, for whatever reason, seem to always play each other whenever we go back and do these hypothetical playoffs. OU was 12-1 Big 12 champions that season. They were led by the Heisman Trophy winner Kyler Murray, and they also had their leading wide receiver Marquise Brown. This was a very good Sooners offense, and as far as who won this game, I'm going to go with Oklahoma. So I think this game truly would have been a coin flip. As far as the spread, it would have been about dead even if these two teams had played each other on a neutral field. Georgia was obviously the more balanced team, had a way better defense, but this OU offense was #1 in the country that year, and they were somewhat competitive with Alabama in the semifinals matchup that year in real life. So by virtue of OU having the bye week and Georgia playing what I think would have been a very competitive game against LSU, I think OU would have edged out Georgia here, but I will definitely hear arguments for Georgia. I think this one could go either way. So once again, we have Alabama versus Ohio State in the semifinals matchup. Bama would have been favored in this game by about 9 points. This Ohio State team wasn't quite the elite level like you've been used to seeing over recent years, and this Alabama team was just really good. Them and Clemson were a notch above the rest at the top of the sport this year. I think Alabama would have won. Ohio State could have been relatively competitive, but Bama definitely wins this game. And then we have Clemson and Oklahoma. Same story here on this side of the bracket. Clemson would have been about a 13-point favorite over OU, and I think it could have been somewhat competitive, but Clemson definitely wins this game. So then we have our eventual national championship game, Alabama versus Clemson. This is what we got in real life, and Clemson won this game 44-16. It was the first time that we had ever seen Alabama get blown out under Nick Saban in any game at any point. Trevor Lawrence had really taken college football by storm as a true freshman, so I think because of all that, Clemson would have won the national championship, and they were the best team in college football in 2018. So that'll do it, guys. Thank you all for watching this video. Leave a like if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment too. I'd like to see some support on this video. I put a lot of effort into it. I tried to keep a solid pace here, not make the video too long, but also give that element of immersion and sort of take you guys back into time with me and place ourselves back into these seasons and sort of figure out what we think would have happened. So leave a comment. Let me know what you guys think would have happened. Let me know where you disagree with me. Let me know what you guys think about the 12-team playoff in general and how you think it would have played out in these seasons. And once again, thank you guys for watching. And as always, have a great day.